Welcome to Faith Works Live. Here's your host, Rebekah Haynie.
You're listening to Faith Works Live. I'm so glad you are, because otherwise I'd be talking to myself in this room with a microphone. No, that's not true. I really appreciate the fact that you are here for this slice of eternity to look at how we can live as believers in the here and now. I believe that God has empowered us for just such a time as this to shine the light of his son, Jesus, in an ever darkening world. But that can be difficult depending on where you are. Right here in the Midwest, it seems like it should be pretty easy, but it's getting less and less comfortable to be a Christian. I saw a pretty interesting thought that it's not impossible to be a Christian, that Christianity is not under attack, but being comfortable as a Christian is under attack, that those days might be gone. And that made me stop and think, I think that's probably accurate. But that's not what we were called. Comfort is not a Christian virtue, I have learned. But that doesn't mean that there can't be an awful lot of joy along the way. It does mean, however, that we need to get really good at being bold about uncomfortable yet true things. And so this is going to be an armor up conversation. If you've listened to anything that we've talked about over the last, 2 weeks at least, we've been hyper-focused on what it means for us to walk as disciples of Christ in an inhospitable environment. And someone that has a great personal experience with being bold and taking bold and uncomfortable stands that still, very much need to be spoken is our guest. We are honored to have Dr. Everett Piper join our airways today. He's the best-selling author of Not a Daycare. He's the former president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University, and he's a host of the fine podcast called The Rebellion. Sir, welcome to our show.
Hi, Rebekah. Thanks for having me on. I'm honored.
Well, it's wonderful to have you with us. I highly recommend your work, your podcast, your writing. And I know that you are basically on the front lines, and you've been speaking out when it's been uncomfortable to do so. And so I really appreciate your boldness, sir.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I'm not sure I'm doing anything better than anybody else, but thanks.
Well, the fact that you're doing it puts you at the head of the class as far as I'm concerned, because there are an awful lot of people who are in leadership roles, purportedly Christian, in organizations, churches, parachurch groups, ministries that are, I hate to say it, a little bit, can I say cowardly? I mean, at the very least, timid or conspicuous by their silence when it comes to, in particular, the way that the gender confusion onslaught has been targeting our kids.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. It seems that within the evangelical community, anyway, that being kind and comfortable, affirming, tolerant are now the highest virtues within the Christian faith, as opposed to being bold and clear and passionate about the truth of the gospel and truth of Christ. In fact, sometimes we seem to be maligned for even arguing that there is such a thing as the objective truth of the gospel. We seem to be disparaged if we hold to the inerrancy of Scripture, for example. And, well, you're one of those right wingers. And I'm just curious by that. We know that the Bible calls upon us to defend the truth. We know that the revelation of God is an objective fact. It's not a subjective construct of your feelings or mine. Mm-hmm. But rationality is being disparaged right now. Reason is being set on the back burner. If you don't feel good about it, then I guess that is your highest that's your highest ideal. That's your summum bonum. That's your highest good, is your feelings. And I think about this, and then I'll just shut up and be quiet here. I think of C.S. Lewis's admonition that if there is no measuring rod outside of those things being measured, you can do no measuring. That is so true today, that we've got to get back to the fact that the measuring rod outside of those things being measured is not your feelings. It's not your emotions. It's not your opinions. It's the Word of God. It's the objective standard of Scripture. So anyway, I agree with you. We've got to understand that truth is not subject to your opinion or mine. Truth is that measuring rod, and that truth is a revelation of God, primarily through Scripture.
Well, and that's why I am comfortable with being bold about some of those, again, politically incorrect truths, because truth doesn't change just because our feelings do. And it's not my truth. It's not my universe. It's God's, and we're living in it. So our goal is not to make up whatever makes us feel good. And really, increasingly, that is the call, it seems, by the world around us. We are called to literally twist space and time and, as you said, logic and reason and reality itself, just to ameliorate the feelings of those who might be more sensitive around us. And I don't think it's a loving thing to lie to someone.
No.
I think that love and truth are two sides of the same coin, if you will, and you really can't have one without the other.
When you talk about the definition of love, I think back to the time where I was blessed to be invited on Bill O'Reilly's show when he was still on Fox News, and O'Reilly, the Factor. And the issue was tolerance. The issue was affirmation, because it was at the time of the Indiana RFRA debate, where Indiana as a state was still trying to decide whether or not they were going to hold true to traditional marriage and the traditional definition, the scientific biological definition of a man and a woman. And O'Reilly probably agreed with my position. However, he was playing the devil's advocate, and he said, well, what about tolerance? And I said to Mr. O'Reilly, on your anniversary, sir, did you send your wife an I tolerate you card? And there was a long, pregnant pause, as if he was wondering, what in the world are you talking about? And I said, Mr. O'Reilly, you surely didn't. Because had you sent your wife an I tolerate you card on your anniversary, it wouldn't have ended very well. And the reason for that is tolerance is an inferior virtue. Tolerance doesn't say I love you. Tolerance doesn't even say I like you. It just says I'll tolerate you. However, Christian charity, Mr. O'Reilly, Christian love is a superior virtue. Whereas tolerance says I could care less about you, do what you want. Christian love, the true definition of love, says I care so much about you that I'll stand in your way, make you feel uncomfortable, and tell you to stop. Tolerance is inferior, love is superior. And that's why you don't send your wife I tolerate you cards on your anniversary. And that's exactly where we are right now. We have called evil good and good evil, bitter sweet and sweet bitter. We've done exactly what the prophet Isaiah warned us against doing. And we're celebrating opinions right now rather than learning what's true and right and real. We are science deniers to the ultimate extreme. We've dumbed down the definition of a woman to nothing but a fabrication and a fantasy of a dysphoric male. Women don't even exist any longer. What could be more misogynistic than for me to tell you you don't exist unless somebody has a feeling that you do? Women's rights don't exist if women aren't real. Title IX is a joke because women's sports can't exist if if men can go in and steal your scholarship, your shower, your bathroom, your sport, steal your very identity and call you and say that you don't exist within the legal definition of a woman any longer. This is misogyny. This is black-facing women to the extreme is really what it is.
But they've got a good argument. They just say, shut up, bigot.
Yeah. Or they punch you in the face, which is what happened to, what's the woman swimmer that's out on the speaking?
Riley Gaines.
Yes. She's speaking at one of the University of California system schools, I believe in San Francisco, if my memory is right, this weekend. And she gets confronted, shouted down. She gets F-bombed and all of this nonsense that comes from the left, from those of the cancel culture. And she actually has a transgender person, a biological male, come up and confront her and punch her in the face because she's speaking the truth. She's saying women have the right to their own sport. And we've actually come to the point as a culture where we're sitting back and applauding a man who physically accosts a woman because all the woman is doing is arguing for her Title IX rights of having her own sport and her own scholarship.
And I just saw the news that the Supreme Court is weighing in, or rather refusing to weigh in to lift an injunction that's been happening in West Virginia, where they've tried to protect girls' sports, women's sports, as to belonging to only women. And when that was brought before the Supreme Court, now they're refusing to lift that injunction, meaning they're not going to stand for West Virginia enforcing that law.
You know, I remember back when I was the president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University, and I delivered a commencement address. I delivered many, probably close to 40 over the course of my tenure as president. But in one of my commencement addresses, I said, okay, I'm up here in my funny cap and gown, and you're out there in yours. In a couple minutes, you're going to come forward, and you're going to stand to my left, your right. I'm going to call off your name alphabetically. You will march across the stage when you hear your name, and I'm going to reach out and hand you a diploma, lean over, shaking your hand and whisper in your ear, congratulations, you now have a degree in opinions. And there was a pause throughout the entire auditorium. People were wondering, what in the world is he talking about? And after I let that just settle for a second or two, I then said, what I just told you on your graduation day is absurd, and you know it. You didn't spend 4 long years of study, taking tests, taking quizzes, eating lousy cafeteria food, having to live with a roommate. You didn't spend 4 long years in the ivory tower in the academy to get a degree in opinions. You came here to major and minor in something: biology, sociology, psychology, accounting, pre-med. And hopefully you learned something over the course of your 4 years of study above and beyond what you knew when you started. Hopefully you acquired some measure of truth in those respective disciplines, because if you didn't, you wasted your time. I said, you don't get degrees in opinions. That's an insult. It's a waste of your money. And besides that, I told the students, the graduates, opinions are dangerous. Opinions always lead to slavery and bondage. Pol Pot had an opinion, and Mao and Robespierre and Chavez and Hitler and Mussolini, all the despots of history had opinions, and it didn't end very well, did it? But truth sets you free. Truth is the only thing that'll give you freedom in life. Opinions always lead to bondage and slavery.
That's so true. And yet we've become ourselves enslaved to probably to our own opinions, because it sounded good when everyone said, well, you can just let go and unmoor yourself from objective truth, and it can be whatever you want it to be. And it's your truth and my truth. Now we find ourselves enslaved to the truth of the highest victim, according to our social ladder. And I want to believe that is not why we find so little courage in Christian leadership right now. I want to believe that there is some other reason, that they're not just afraid of the people that cry the loudest. I'm not sure that I'm right, though.
I could blame. I'm not going to put this on you. I could blame various different entities of culture for the collapse of common sense that's common, natural law, the laws of nature and nature's God, self-evident truths that have been endowed to us by our Creator, the truth of Christ, the truth of Scripture. I could blame several entities for that failure, but I think you could probably narrow it down to 3: parents, pastors, and teachers. We could argue, couldn't we, that there are 3 major entities that are responsible for inculcating culture's values to its progeny, to the next generation: parents and pastors and teachers. Well, parents are helicoptering all around, wanting to be the best friend of their sons and daughters rather than a good mom and dad. And teachers have bought the lie. They've imbibed the Kool-Aid of social emotional learning and SJW, BLM, CRT, LGBTQIA, all of the alphabet soup lunacy of what's popular rather than what's true. And then we have preachers that are failing to confront this nonsense and teach their congregants how to engage in the market square of ideas with biblical truth. When all 3 of those entities let down their guard and want to be popular rather than right, we've got a mess on our hands. And that's exactly where we are as a culture right now. At least I would argue so.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I would line up to give an amen. I know that when we were discussing before this horrible attack in the Nashville Covenant Christian School, and how is it possible that just a week later it's largely disappeared from the headlines? I don't know why this isn't still on everyone's minds. But you noted at the time that there have been many Christian leaders that were surprisingly, perhaps eerily quiet about the incident. And I wondered if you wouldn't mind expounding on what you noticed, or maybe what was conspicuous by its absence.
Well, not only by its absence, where Christian leaders didn't speak out and speak to the reality. I mean, let's just cut to the chase here. You had an angry transgender person Yet a female who's starting to identify as a male. She attended that school in earlier years. She's angry with the school. Why? It's a conservative Christian school. She doesn't agree with their values, their worldview. She thinks they're bigots because culture has taught her that if anybody disagrees with her feelings, with her constructs of what a man or a woman is, that they are bigots, they're evil, they're intolerant, they should be punished. So what does she do? She enters into her alma mater and she hunts down Christian children and shoots them. She hunts down a janitor and two administrators and kills them. Now, if you would reverse this story and say that some KKK extremist or a neo-Nazi went into a synagogue and hunted down Jews and killed them, or if some white supremacist entered into a black church, hunted down blacks and killed them, the media rightfully would be outraged and would point out the obvious. This is dangerous when we start maligning people because of the color of their skin or because of their religious beliefs. But here we have Christians, children, 9-year-old believers in Jesus Christ who are killed because of their faith and their simple desire to live in accordance to God's holy word. They're killed for this. And the media is silent. Nobody wants to speak the obvious. Well, you would think that evangelical leaders would at least point that out, but no. I had a gentleman in my own denomination, or at least my former denomination, used to be on my board of trustees. He was a district superintendent for the Kansas district of the Wesleyan Church. He immediately tweets out that he is angered and befuddled by the fact that evangelicals are focusing more on the right to bear arms rather than sensible gun control. He completely ignores the fact that this is the butchering, the intentional targeting of Christians. He completely ignores that. He doesn't even defend the poor families that just lost their children, who are probably conservative evangelicals because they chose to send their kid to a conservative, Bible-believing teaching school. He completely ignores that, and he focuses on gun control. Talk about tone deaf. Talk about blaming the victims for their own death, for their own martyrdom. He blames them rather than talking about the facts of the matter and that they were killed because of their faith.
Yeah, and we've got the Biden administration, of course, which they're, an exercise in futility, and they're out talking about how it's all the trans folks that are the real victims here. And don't forget, because they have to keep reiterating this lie over and over again for their own political purposes. When if anyone, any well-meaning, open-minded person were to look at the situation, it's clear where the sympathy would lie. It's clear where the anger, where the justifiable outrage should lie. And yet they just have to keep reasserting, don't forget how you're really supposed to think.
Well, and is it possible that the broken worldview, a worldview that teaches victimization and vengeance, which you could clearly make the case that LGBTQIA, CRT, SEL, BLM, all of these worldviews focus on blaming others for whatever it is that you have to suffer on a daily basis. It's pointing the finger outward of blame rather than looking in the mirror and accepting the fact that for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And that you are the problem. Like G.K. Chesterton said when he was asked to write an essay on what's wrong with the world, he returned he returned the invitation with a one-word response, a one-sentence response, and he said, "Dear sirs, I am yours truly, G.K. Chesterton." Rather than teaching that we all are responsible for the brokenness of culture, CRT teaches that it's everyone else's fault other than yours, and it's everyone else's responsibility to give you what you deserve and what you want. This is a very dangerous place for us to be, where we teach people to target others because you are a victim and therefore you deserve your pound of flesh, you deserve vengeance, you deserve reparations, you deserve something from them. If that's where we are as a culture, it's what David Horowitz called the rule of the gang, that we are going to be subject to whoever has the most power at any given time, and they will crush everyone who is in their way and anyone who dares dissent. It's very, very dangerous, and it's also antithetical to our constitutional republic.
Well, and we are in the danger of being held in that place, I say, largely because of the silence and because of the timidity of people that ought to know better, of people that should be willing to stand up for their rights, of Christians, of conservatives, of just freedom-loving Americans that should be willing to fight for those rights for ourselves that we have been guaranteed in the Constitution. And yet more and more, we have allowed those to slide away to our own peril, and it's not going to become any easier to stand up. Now, I know that as Christians, we have to respond differently to these types of situations than the world does, absolutely. But I don't believe that we ought to be getting into debates about gun control right off the bat. Like you said, that's a horrible idea, horrible suggestion. But I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts on how we respond as Christians to something like this attack at the Nashville school with a new way of thinking that upholds mercy for sinners, obviously, but also justice and protection for the innocent.
Well, my standard response when somebody asks, how do we engage culture? How do we engage in a debate, a good exchange of ideas, or even an argument, if you will, call it what you want. How should we as Christians enter into the market square of ideas, into the town square, and be effective for the gospel, for a biblical worldview? And I think the best answer, at least for me, is to go back to Jesus and what was his style of engagement? What was the style of Christ when it came to apologetics? What was Jesus's method of apologetics? And I think it was very simple and very clear. The smartest guy that ever walked the face of the earth. He is the Word made flesh and dwelling among us. He is the great I am. He's the Alpha and the Omega. He is God incarnate. He probably could have won the debate had he chosen to do so. I doubt there was much he didn't know. But Jesus himself, when he was confronted with an adversary, with a postmodern know-it-all of his day, if you will, like the Pharisees or the Sadducees or even the Roman establishment, Jesus almost always refused to engage in debate. He almost always just responded with a rhetorical question. Whose face is on the coin? Why do you call me Lord? Do you want to pick up the first stone and throw it? And then Jesus, the man who is defined, the God who defines himself as the Alpha and Omega, an alphabet. He defines himself as the Word. All knowledge, all truth is within his grasp. He himself refuses to lower himself to that foolish argument, and he just asks a rhetorical question that exposes the lie of his adversary to the point where they more often than not just drop their stones and walk away. Maybe we should copy Jesus and learn to ask rhetorical questions like this. Can you tolerate my intolerance? And then be quiet. Do you hate hateful people? Are you sure that nothing is sure? Do you know that nothing can be known? And are you absolutely confident there are no absolutes? And are you pro-science? And if so, do you believe in biology, physiology, genetics, and DNA? Is there such a thing as a scientifically defined man and woman? Do you believe in the innocence of children? And if so, why are you dumbing down the conversation of sexual engagement to the level where you're telling children that they can consent to cut off their own genitalia? And are you going to then take it to the next step? Because if a child has the moral authority to make decisions about his sexual identity, then aren't you going to start arguing that the same child will have the moral authority to make decisions about sexual engagement and activity with whoever that child feels he or she wants to? They're dumbing down the definition of everything. And I think if we ask some rhetorical questions that just expose the lie and then be quiet and let them respond, you're going to find that they're confused. They don't know what to say. And we will win some of them over.
Excellent advice. Dr. Everett Piper is our guest. He's the best-selling author of Not a Daycare. He's the former president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University. And hear his fine podcast called The Rebellion. You will not leave the podcast the same way that you entered it. He's a guy that will activate you. And I consider that quite a compliment. He'll make you think. And, some of us are not equipped for critical thinking. We've run out of practice. So there's no better time than now to get armored up. We've got to take a quick break, but we'll come back with a few more minutes of Dr. Piper's insights. When we return, you're listening to FaithWorks Live. When a woman faces an unplanned pregnancy, every possible emotion goes through her head. Where can she go for help and for hope? She can go to Intervisions. Here in our metro, we have 2 healthcare clinics where she will find hope and help. From free pregnancy testing and STD testing to free ultrasounds, Intervisions serves women and men with STDs who find themselves in vulnerable situations. They're completely free of charge because of generous donations from folks like you. And their medical clinics help their patients get all the information that they deserve, that empowers them to make life-affirming decisions. That's what they do at Intervisions Healthcare Clinics right here in Des Moines. Learn more at intervisionshealthcare.org. That's intervisionshealthcare.org. And you can call 24 hours a day at 515-440-CARE. That's 515-440-2273. In today's world, security has never been more vital. And at FaithWorks Live, we're proud to partner with VeriGuard Security. It's a professional physical security service, and they're really raising the bar in security and private investigations. Whether you need a team of professional officers to protect what you have worked hard to build, or their mobile security units for multiple properties or large locations, from business or corporate properties to your home or neighborhood. Perhaps you've got an event coming up. They secure quality security coverage for events large and small, because it's about peace of mind and protecting you, your family, your team, and your property. Settle for nothing less than the best when it comes to your security. You shouldn't have to compromise. When it comes to security, you can trust VeriGuard. Contact them today at verigard.us. That's VARA guard.us. For security service, you can trust VeriGuard. So glad you're with us, and what a day it is. You're listening to FaithWorks Live. Rebekah Haynie is my name, our special guest. And I'm very excited to speak with Dr. Everett Piper. And he's a best-selling author. He's the former president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University. Check out his podcast called The Rebellion. It's on Spotify and, wherever your finer podcasts are found. I highly recommend it, Everett, not just because your intro incorporates one of my favorite Western leaders, which is Winston Churchill, but one recent episode that I wanted to highlight in our conversation was your discussion on whose children are they? Who do your children belong to? Because there are forces that are outright claiming ownership of our kids. That's not even a conspiracy theory. They're literally saying it outright. They're just being bold about it. And I don't think that they have any right to my kids. Thank you very much. No, not here, not now, not ever. God gave them to me. Thank you. But it's something that I have faced a lot of blowback for calling out those same dark forces, shall we say. And I really think that more and more parents and grandparents need to kind of wake up to what's going on on that front.
Well, I'm going to pick on my own industry here in responding to you. And I think I have the right to, and maybe I even have the responsibility to. I'm obviously an educator. I made my career in the ivory tower. I was the college president for nearly 18 years. And prior to that, I served in various different executive roles, vice presidential roles at several different universities. So I love education. Higher education changed my life. I believe deeply in Christian, evangelical, liberal arts education. And in fact, a sidebar here, the word liberal arts means what? It means liberty. A liberal arts institution was established to educate a free man and a free woman, a free society, a free church, a free culture. It was an education in liberty. And it goes back some 1,000 years to Oxford and Cambridge. A liberal arts institution was an education in freedom. And often, if not almost always, the mission statement of those institutions, some 100, 200, 300, 500 years ago, the mission statement was what? You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. It was the very words of Christ in the Gospels, where Jesus himself defined himself as truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one shall come to the Father but by me. So I believe in education. But education is broken right now. The ivory tower has become the Tower of Babel. We're making no sense any longer. We're actually arguing, and this is not hyperbole. You are not exaggerating, nor am I. The educational establishment, the teachers' unions, and many of the college and university schools of education are teaching the next generation of teachers, as well as trying to indoctrinate your own students, your own children, that they do not belong to mom and dad. They belong to the state. And that the teachers are experts that know a lot better on how to raise a child than a parent does. And if the child wants to, if a 10-year-old child wants to transition, the teachers are being told by the establishment, by the ivory tower and the teachers union, and they're being supported by many state legislators, that that teacher has the right to tell your child, your son and daughter, not to talk to you about their sexual confusion. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They start providing confusing ideas through sex education, like gender is not biologically determined. It's an emotional thing. It's in the head. It's not in the body. It's your thoughts and feelings. It's not a biological fact. They teach young children these confusing ideas. Then when they start asking questions, they say, well, don't talk to mom and dad because your mom and dad may disagree. They're intolerant, they're bigoted, and they're not going to affirm you. And then they run the kid off to sex change counseling and start injecting hormones in them that will block their puberty and their natural development. This is not an exaggeration. We're arguing about it in Oklahoma right now. The reddest of red states, we've got a legislature that doesn't understand what I'm saying right now and is trying to prop up and support this particular agenda. The University of Oklahoma Medical School and Hospital down in Oklahoma City is providing transgender therapies to minors. And we have to step in and say, wait a second, what are you doing? Well, they're not your kids, they say. They're our kids. Parents don't understand, they say. We're experts, we do. And your children are confused and they're coming to us for help because they're afraid of you and you will disagree. They're putting all of this stuff upon 10 and 12 and 14-year-olds. And lo and behold, everybody's surprised that we now have upwards of 15% of Gen Z and millennial age boys, girls, and women that are now confused about their identity and claiming to be trans.
Yeah, it's not coming from nowhere. It's coming from a concerted effort to confuse. And that, of course, comes from the father of lies. But there's no excuse, I think, for Christian families in particular to send their kids into that kind of den of snakes. I mean, and that's not to say, it seems like I have to lay this disclaimer. Like you said, there are wonderful people involved in education that truly do care about kids and about educating them, about opening their minds to the wonders of all the best liberal education in all the best senses classically. But there are an awful lot of people who have gone into education and who have been told that their job is to teach kids what society needs them to know, not what parents want them to know, that they stand in opposition to the parents, to the benighted views of those old, crusty conservative parents, that you have to expose the kids to all of these things because this is the way forward. This is the new enlightenment, so to speak. The progressive agenda is what these kids need to know, and they're not going to get it from their intolerant parents at home. And so they've set them up as that the teachers are, that parents are the enemy. And you literally now have teachers expressing this. I've seen it in legislative sessions regarding these laws. I've seen it in school board meetings where parents come in and they're immediately shut down. They're seen as the enemy, where teachers are horrified that parents might actually have a say in what books their kids are reading in school libraries because, well, parents aren't specially educated. They're not the experts. We are. And yet when I question, now me speaking personally, I question the Christian parents continuing to send their kids back into these public schools. And I'm told, we've chosen to homeschool in our family because of precisely some of these things. But I'm told that that is a privileged position and that, my privilege is showing that I'm a conspiracy theorist, all these kinds of things, and that that's not a workable solution. So Christian parents just have to keep sending their kids out into the public school arena where I believe it's very dangerous for their young minds and for their souls. So I wonder if you wouldn't, just give me a couple of notes to respond back to people when I'm in these types of discussions. What would you say to people who don't see what you and I are saying so clearly?
Well, you're spot on, and I have said many times, and I know it's even going to offend maybe some of your listeners. But
That's
get your
all
kids
right.
out of
That
these public
happens.
schools.
That happens.
Everybody should get their kids out of these public schools, and I mean that. Does that mean that there's no good teacher left in a public school? No. Surely we still have a few good conservative Christians, Bible believing people who are trying to fight the good fight from within the public school industry. I know that. You know that. Everybody knows that.
Mm-hmm.
But by and large, they're losing. And they're losing because the administration doesn't support them. The Christian has been cowed into silence for fear of losing his or her job if they're too clear and too bold in confronting some of the lunacy of our day. So your kids are left to fend for themselves. Or maybe they've got a Christian teacher who's a bit covert and is there to help them, but do it silently and quietly without really talking about the Bible. This is the state of education today, and it's shameful. Get your kids out of these schools. And even if you choose to send your child to a Christian school, ask the right questions. Because unfortunately, many of the Christian schools have bought into critical race theory. They've bought into Black Lives Matter. They've ignored the fact that BLM actually is a neo-Marxist organization that in its own charter and mission statement says that one of their goals is to queer the nuclear family and to dismantle Western patriarchy. They say this. Now, why in the world would you send your 10-year-old, 12-year-old, or 14-year-old off to a public school or a Christian school that believes that nonsense? Do you think your teenager or your preteen is going to be able to survive that intellectual, ideological onslaught? We cannot be missionaries vicariously through our children. It is your job and my job as a parent to protect our children from this. People say, well, you're overprotective. Your kid won't get exposed to the real world. Well, good. I'm glad I'm guilty as charged.
Yep.
I am protecting my son from this mess, and I don't apologize for it. And I don't want a 14-year-old exposed to the bluest eyes. Who wrote that? I think it was
Toni
Mia
Morrison.
Kababi.
Toni Morrison.
Toni Morris. Mia Kababi is the genderqueer. Those two books are awful. They're terrible books. I'm not even going to discuss it on your show because it's embarrassing to do so. But yet we're putting those books in front of 12 and 14-year-olds in our local public schools. And here's the thing. When parents go ask for the right to do nothing but receive the material, a list of books that are offered through the curriculum of given classes as well as available in the local public school library. If you do nothing but that, you're maligned, you're disparaged, you're a terrible human being just for wanting to know what your kid is being taught. In fact, as you well know, you've probably covered it. Just last week, I believe it was, the Parents' Rights Bill in the House of Representatives in the United States Congress passed out of House, but every single Democrat voted against it. Every single one. Every single Democrat voted against your simple right to know what your kid is being taught, to receive the curriculum, the syllabus, and see what assignments and books and material are being made available to your son and daughter. That's all this bill called for. Now, who in their right mind would think that's a bad idea to get parents involved and have them understand what books are being used to teach their kid? They don't want you to know, and there's a reason they don't want you to know.
Well, and it seems like it's the bare minimum of expectation, and it does call on parents to be more involved, though. And I think there's an awful lot of us that have gotten altogether too comfortable, to use that recurring theme, with just saying, all right, well, my life is my life, and in order to support my lifestyle, we have to work and we have to do these things, and so the kids have to be in school, and I can't afford private education, and so we make an awful lot of excuses. And instead, I've been there. Okay. I know that it can be really difficult to rearrange your life around educating your kids, whether that's homeschool or whether you're making sacrifices to put your kids in private Christian school, which, that's not a magic bullet by any means, but it at least establishes a foundational worldview that you can say, yes, I sign off on this. I agree with this. I trust these folks with my kids, ultimately so valuable, their brains, their minds, their imagination, their souls. I don't believe that it's too much to ask to make sacrifices. Like, we all make sacrifices for our priorities. And I don't think that there's anything more valuable or more worth sacrificing for on this side of eternity than our own kids. And I'm not trying to guilt trip parents. I'm just saying, exactly as you are, they deserve better than these public schools. We cannot allow that to be the default anymore. We have to protect them. We have to actually educate them. It's not as though they're learning reading, writing, and arithmetic in those classrooms anyway. And the kids deserve better than that, is what I'm saying. And it's time for parents to actually place them as a priority and do whatever it takes to give their kids an actual education and not an indoctrination.
Spot on. And I know it's easy for you to say, it's easy for me to say, or at least that's how some people will respond. They assume that we have a greater access to private education or even more time than they do to homeschool. Okay, I can't judge somebody else's time or pocketbook, but what I can say and what I think I can judge is this: every parent is given the responsibility by God himself to train up a child in the way he should go so that when he is old, he will not depart. It's your responsibility, not the government's. It's no one else's job other than yours and mine to train up our respective children in the way they should go so that they will not depart when they grow old. And you're not going to accomplish that if you hand that responsibility off to someone else, whether it be your local public schools, i.e. the government, or whether it be a private school that you didn't bother to check out enough, and it's teaching essentially the exact same thing as the public school, and now it's costing you money. Mm-hmm. We have to make it a priority and sacrifice whatever we need to sacrifice for the sake of our children. And you and I both know hundreds of parents who didn't have great resources, who have made that sacrifice, and they have come out the better for it because they raised their children well. And they've got godly children now rather than children that are totally lost because they suffered the indoctrination and the ideological carcinogens. Our kids are suffering from cancer of heart, mind, and soul because they're consuming carcinogens daily through the educational establishment. And then we turn around and we're surprised that they've got cancer. Well, no, we shouldn't be surprised because it's always garbage in, garbage out. Ideas are always going to have consequences, and bad ideas are always going to bear bad consequences and fruit in culture. Good ideas, good culture, good kids, good community. Bad ideas, you're going to get the opposite. That's straight from Richard Weaver in 1948 in his seminal work, Ideas Have Consequences. That's what he said. It's straight from the Bible because we've known that since day one, that as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Well, where do you get those ideas that you put in heart and mind? You get them from your education, and the education has to be grounded in what's true rather than what's popular.
Absolutely. And I'm going to give a Profile and Courage Award to each and every homeschool parent that is listening right now, because you are really the hope, I think, of the next generation. Every parent that is seeing personally to the responsibility of and the amazing privilege of educating our children and raising them up, training them up in the way that they should go, whether that's homeschool or Christian school. Like you said, but you got to be careful with some of the Christian schools. We just can't continue to outsource that education and expect for it to be anything other than outside of the Christian foundation, the Christian worldview. I will say there's a marvelous opportunity, I think, for churches to step up and establish cooperative efforts in education. I mean, that's where Christian schools used to exist with far more frequency. And I mean, well, why not make it affordable? Why not make every single church a place where kids can also educate or also be educated? Why can't parents get together and do co-ops and work around their schedules? And we can get creative with this. It just has to be the priority, and we have to stop. For me, I know with getting healthy and with many other reasons, when you stop making excuses, when you no longer accept the situation as the status quo, it's not acceptable to you. And public school and that standard of government indoctrination is not acceptable anymore. And once we rule that out, we can start getting creative with the solutions that allow parents to do what they need to do to make ends meet, but also to educate their children in truth as well. So I guess that's just my little public service announcement for Christian schools.
And again, I agree with you completely. And back to the obvious with regard to today's homeschooling, the definition of homeschooling as it comes to us today versus what it was 20 years ago. everybody knows that homeschooling now is much more complex and much more interactive within the community than it used to be. Homeschooling used to be a mom, dad just sitting down with their children in the living room all day long and trying to teach them what they needed to be taught to progress in mathematics and reading and writing and rhetoric. But today you've got cooperative efforts within the homeschooling industry. People are sharing the responsibility with one another. And these homeschool co-ops are pervasive across the land. So you get help. You get help from your neighbor. You get help from people who share your values and share your priority in terms of raising your children. And it's a lot more effective. And you don't feel alone like you used to in the homeschooling industry. And there still are some good Christian schools. And they're often much less expensive than people think. I know we sent our two boys to a Christian school where the average expense out of your pocket, out of the tax base for public education is around $15,000 a year per kid. We sent our kids to a local Christian school that did a fine job. It didn't have all the bells and whistles, gymnasiums and stadiums and all that kind of stuff, but we spent $4,800, $5,000 a year to send our kid to a Christian school that, frankly, was doing a lot better job at teaching the basics than the public school was, and our kids weren't being indoctrinated by the junk. So if you can afford it and squeeze a few pennies together, sell a boat, so a recreational vehicle, or put a little bit more money aside to come up with those dollars for private school, great. But if you can't afford it, homeschooling is very, very possible for almost anybody today because they can get help from the co-ops.
Yeah, well, and you can afford just about anything on Google. I mean, I was one of those OG homeschoolers where everyone looked at us weird because they'd never heard of such a thing before. But now that we're the next generation, now we're doing the homeschooling thing here at our household, and it is so much more affordable than it ever was. There's so many more resources. So I don't know, that gives me an awful lot of hope, I have to say. And hope is one thing that I don't think we can run out of. I was looking at some of your posts, thinking about the timeliness of our focus on the resurrection, that has to be our motivation. It really does. I think there is a way to fight the quote unquote culture war that just leaves you angry and exhausted, but that is not, I think, helpful for any servant of Christ. And to think as we remember this momentous day, most momentous day in all of human history, and what happened on a hill far away on an old rugged cross, I think that has to be our motivation.
Well, my article for the Washington Times this weekend, in fact, it was it just was published about an hour ago for the Easter weekend. I asked the rhetorical question: what is the biggest news story in all of history? I mean, we're 24-hour news consumers now, and if somebody were to ask you what is the biggest story of the week, of the month, of the day, you could probably come up with something. But what is the biggest story of all of human history? And I would argue, and I think objectively so, even if you claim not to be a believer, you've got to argue that the story of the resurrection changed the course of the Western world. I mean, the story of the resurrection is pervasive throughout the very foundations of Western Europe and the American experiment, of even South America, of Canada. The resurrection has served as the foundation for constructing a constitutional republic. The resurrection is the story that 2.2 billion people worldwide still claim and profess to believe. 2.2 billion Christians. Now, I'm not saying they're all born again, but what I am saying is if you claim to be a Christian, you've got to, at least at rock bottom, embrace the resurrection, that Jesus rose from the grave. And the oldest creed is not the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed or the Athanasian Creed. The oldest creed is actually cited by the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the Church of Corinth. Some say that this creed that he cites is written some 3 to 5 years after the events themselves, that this creed was actually circulating within the first century church just a handful of years after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And in that creed itself, Paul says that 500 people saw Jesus alive and walking among them after the resurrection. So you had 500 fact checkers that could have refuted the story, and none of them did. We have no evidence whatsoever in recorded history that any of those people came forward and said, this isn't true. We fact checked it and find it to be misleading. No one did that. People gave their lives. All of the apostles, save one, died martyrs. And even the one that didn't die as a martyr, the apostle John, was tortured at great measure. Some say he was actually boiled in oil and survived. These men gave their lives. Their lives, they were filleted, they were sawn asunder, they were impaled on pikes, they were crucified, they were beheaded, they were boiled in oil. And none of them recanted the story of the resurrection. 500 people saw Jesus, and none of them wrote anything or said anything to the contrary. This is a historical fact. It's the greatest news story in all of history, and we need to take confidence in it, that it is a fact. It's not a fabrication or a fable. And we also need to understand that the man who rose from the grave, the great I am, the word made flesh and dwelling among us, told us, promised us that the gates of hell will not prevail against him or his church. We win. We know the end of the story, and it's a wonderful time to be alive for such a time as this.
Amen. For he died to sin once for all, and the life he lives to God. In the same way, we will count ourselves dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. Dr. Everett Piper, thank you so much for joining our show. You've given us just so much, I would say, to think about and to ponder, but really it's an activating conversation. I feel equipped, I feel armored up and ready to go in and do battle in all the best ways. So I love your work. Thank you so much for your continuing to write boldly and reasonably as well. And I invite everyone to check out your podcast, check out your writing, and to pray for you in your continued work. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Check out Dr. Everett Piper's podcast. It's called The Rebellion, and of course his frequent columns, the Washington Times, as well as many other outlets. I'll link to his podcast down below. So, when you're finished listening to all of ours, you could check those out as well. If you've enjoyed this conversation, and I don't know why you wouldn't. I mean, it had just about everything you could possibly think of. Let's pass it on to a friend. Let somebody know ways to get activated. And I keep using that term because I remember faith without works is dead. You will show your faith by your works. This is not a time where Christians can keep silent any longer. I think we've frankly had enough of that. We can no longer wait until it's more comfortable to stand for Christ. The time is now, but God has given us all that we need for just such a time as this. We have him. Maybe it feels like we're not enough, but we are not alone, and never will he leave us nor forsake us. We, as Dr. Piper was just pointing out, the resurrected Lord means we have really everything that we need to get through today and to move on to a brighter tomorrow. That same resurrection power is the promise of God in us, in those who believe. And it is with that hope that we carry on, that we move forward into our culture that is desperately in need of the love, the redeeming love of Christ. So until next time, we have a mission, so let's be about it. Hey, what's for dinner? If you're like me, I hear that 15 times a day. And fortunately, I have a plan. It's typically Animus beef at our house. We are such big fans of Animus beef at the Haynie home because it's just great quality beef. There's no steroids or antibiotics. It's naturally raised butcher beef. They sell by the quarter, the half, or the whole, and they support your local meat lockers, so they can help you get it processed in a way that works for you. In this economy, it's good to have affordable options for your meat. And if you're willing to make a good investment in your nutrition for a healthy menu plan, I highly recommend Animus Beef. Contact Dave and Mary Lynn at animusbeef.com. They welcome your questions. They'll help get you on the schedule. They have locker dates coming up. Don't wait. Secure your locker date today. Go to animusbeef.com. That's OHNEMUS beef.com.
Okay, progress report. First, reference to Jesus in public schools.
Taken care of, sir. It's now illegal.
Good. prayer in school?
Also illegal, sir.
What about teaching the 10 Commandments?
No problem. They can't even display them in public schools.
Creation account?
Evolution presently taught as fact. No need for God.
Outstanding. Any other issues?
What about the fact that there actually is a God?
People won't think about that.
But what about the fact that Jesus came from heaven and all the miracles he performed to prove it?
Or the prophecies he fulfilled?
Sir, there's also the problem that evolution assumes something came from nothing. How do they explain life itself?
Listen, we've eliminated any instruction or reference to God in a public setting. If we can keep people busy and distracted, they won't have time to consider God.
The world has done its best to remove God from our thinking. Has it succeeded with you? Another message from Lifeline Productions, located on the web at lifelinepro.com.
There's no better time than now to stand for life. And you can stand with Iowa's original pro-life organization, Pulse for Life. They're the longest standing nonprofit pro-life organization in Iowa, and they're dedicated to informing, educating, and inspiring a new generation to value the sanctity of all human life, from fertilization until natural death. They serve at the State House. They educate in classrooms, at events. They proudly serve on the coalition of pro-life leaders. They are on the front lines of the battle against this throwaway culture of death that we see all around us, and we are winning ground. Hearts and minds are changing, and the pro-life movement is continuing to grow. And you can be a part of the exciting things that are happening right here in our own backyard at pulseforlife.org and get your finger on the pro-life pulse. Sign up for their newsletter, find ways that you can make a difference, and how you can change hearts and minds with their pro-life apologetics course, pulseforlife.org.